Welcome to this month's Creation Justice webinar, a gathering place for building a movement, a gathering place for those with a passion and a purpose for caring for God's creation and protecting God's creation. I'm Brooks Barron. I'm the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. As always, I am joined by my friend, colleague, and co-host, the Reverend Michael Malcolm. He is the Executive Director for the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. Michael, before I introduce our amazing lineup of speakers for today, I'd love to get your thoughts about how we might frame and think about today's conversation. We're talking about land today. It's a big biblical issue, literally from the start of creation onward. It's a big issue. It's an issue in terms of inheritance. It's an issue in terms of jubilee and justice. It's an issue in terms of let's make it to the promised land. And of course, what Christians have done with those scriptures is a whole nother story. What are your thoughts as we kind of orient ourselves theologically and spiritually for today's conversation?
You know, Brooks, it's also a lesson in toxic theology. This frame of thought gave way to a dominion theology that is perverted and not of God. This toxic theology has birthed extractive relationships with cosmos and community. We have seen this played out in the history of America's taking of indigenous lands from our indigenous siblings. We've seen it when we've looked at the extraction of Black bodies during the times when America enslaved humans. We've even seen it today. We see it as our governmental system uses eminent domain to build pipelines and cop cities and industrial polluting facilities on Black, brown, and indigenous lands. The taking of land is a systemic issue. I look forward to hearing from our guests for some achievable solutions that we can follow after this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, as always, for helping us to orient our thoughts and get us grounded for our conversation. Let me now introduce our speakers in the order in which they'll be speaking. First up, we'll have Sarah Augustine, who is of Pueblo descendant. She is the founder of the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery and the executive director of the Dispute Resolution Center in Washington State. She is the co-founder of the Suriname Indigenous Health Fund, where she has advocated for vulnerable Indigenous peoples since 2004. She has represented the interests of Indigenous community partners to the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and a host of institutions. She is the author of The Land is Not Empty, Following Jesus and Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery. We'll then have Katerina Gea, who is a Mennonite pastor who offers leadership to Wild Church in Fresno, California. She is also a gardener and has planted gardens alongside incarcerated people in state prisons and has worked with churches to grow vibrant community gardens in abandoned lots. She currently serves as an organizer for the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. Recently, she was a fellow for Creation Justice Ministries as part of an initiative to move the Christian church toward truth and healing in relationship to Indigenous peoples in light of harms done under colonialism in California. Then we will have Angie Comeaux, who is a Muskogee Hoktay of mixed Muskogee, Choctaw, Cherokee, and Creole descent. In 2020, she acquired what is now Hummingbird Springs Farm in Florala, Alabama, which is on the ancestral Muskogee land. She and her partner are converting it into an indigenous food forest. Angela is a clinical research nurse by trade and is currently enrolled in the Appalachian Center for Natural Health's Herbal Practitioner Program. She is integral to numerous organizations and is a founding member of the Bobancha collective, an Indigenous mutual aid and herbal medicine collective. We are delighted to have each of our panelists here today. And let us see here. I think Sarah is still trying to connect with us. So, Katerina, if you could get us started, that would be terrific.
Sure, I'm happy to start us off. I'm Katerina Gea, and thank you so much for joining this webinar. Wherever we are on Indigenous lands. And so I invite you, if you don't already know what lands that you are dwelling on, to look that up and find more information. There's a great link, a native lands map that is available where you can look up whose territories you are on and the lands that Indigenous peoples are still on today. And so I'll just go ahead and put a link in the chat to that. I'm coming to you from Yokuts and Mono territories in Central California. For me, the issue of land back is not only a justice issue, but it is a spiritual and theological issue. And I really believe that the church has a role to play in land back and in the wider work of reparative justice in response to the doctrine of discovery, which I hope my colleague and coworker, Sarah Augustine, will be sharing a little bit more about later on this panel. The church has a responsibility today in light of the harms done that Reverend Malcolm has mentioned, the ways that colonization and Christianity went hand in hand in stealing land and stealing labor. We have inherited the legacy of dominion and domination. And so what are we going to do about it today? In the coalition I work with, the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, we often say that what was done in the name of Christ needs to be undone in the name of Christ. So we can tap into Christian theology and scripture, though they were used through that toxic theology to justify the doctrine of discovery, to justify conquest. For example, the Promised Lands texts that were so twisted to justify genocide on these lands. We can also turn to liberating theology and scriptures to undo and to challenge the frameworks of dominion and domination. Scripture can be a liberatory and decolonizing tool for good news for the poor and dispossessed and those willing to stand with them. So I look to Jesus, and I invite us to imagine Jesus not as that white guy with flowing blonde hair, but a Jesus who is a Jewish, Palestinian, Indigenous man, a brown man, inspired by the ancient Jewish vision of Jubilee. And Jubilee for me is at the heart of why we advocate for land justice and land return. Jesus proclaimed this in his mission statement of good news to the poor, proclaimed freedom to those in captivity, the year of the Lord's favor, or the Jubilee year, when land would be returned to original stewards. And throughout his life and ministry, I see Jesus calling people into Jubilee community. So some of you might be familiar with the story of Zacchaeus, for example, the tax collector in Luke 19. Maybe like me, you grew up with that song, Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and it talks about how Zacchaeus climbed up into the sycamore tree to encounter Jesus. He was intrigued by this teacher going around, and he wanted relationship. It seems he wanted what Jesus was offering, and yet Zacchaeus is someone who has been colonized by Rome, part of the Jewish community. And he has been used by Rome as a tax collector to basically steal from his own people to enrich himself. He didn't do anything illegal from what we can tell. Everything he was doing was totally legal under the system of the day, but it was still unethical. And when Zacchaeus encounters Jesus, he is up high and Jesus is down low. And Jesus calls him down. Jesus calls him down into relationship and down into repentance, to release his unjust gains, his possessions, and Zacchaeus promises publicly to return half the wealth that he has gained to the poor. And then he says, if I have defrauded anyone, I will pay back 4 times as much. So he acknowledges, he tells the truth about what he has done. He repents and releases what's not his to own back to the community with 400% restitution. So I see in that story a parable for the church today. Not just for individuals to identify with Zacchaeus, but kind of capital C church, that we are called by Jesus into decolonization and repentance for unjust gains, for not only what we individually owe, but on a systemic level, the harms that have been done in the name of Christ on these lands, the wounds that creation still bears and groans with under the weight of extractive industry, of colonization, of land theft and genocide, of stolen labor, that there have been deep harms that have been committed, and to be restored into community, we need to make amends today. Repair starts with truth-telling. It continues, not just ends with apologies or repudiation statements, as a lot of churches have done, but it really requires a commitment to justice, to return what has stolen. And when that happened in the story of Zacchaeus, Jesus proclaims, today salvation has come to this house. I really am so struck. I grew up with ideas of salvation that were so narrow. It was about our souls being saved for heaven. But salvation in this text is about healing and deliverance and justice and right relations. Zacchaeus is restored to the covenant community as a result of his release, of his return of unjust gain, and shalom is brought about in the process. So I just wanted to offer that today as maybe a framing as we think about land return, land repair, about decolonization, that I really see in this story an opportunity for the church. The church, capital C, is actually the largest non-governmental landowner in the world. It's not like a wealthy oil baron. It's not McDonald's or whatever. Actually, the church owns the most land in the world. And so we have an opportunity today to seek to make amends, to practice Jubilee, and to respond to the call of Indigenous Jesus to release and repair harms done, and to find our own restoration in the process. So I want to just pause there and just see, back over to you, Reverend Malcolm or Reverend Brooks, if there are any questions or responses. I'm not even sure where I'm at time-wise. I feel like I got into preaching mode.
Hey, you're doing great.
Yeah.
Well, we hope to hear some more preaching, and as we engage later on with questions and answers. But thank you so much for those remarks. We'll give an opportunity now to hear from Angela. Angela, what thoughts do you have to share with us today?
First, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. Songo, Angela Comeaux, Jaha Jishkados, Babancha, Hitchka Youngus, Monlege Yondas, Judgekit, Nogasolgan, Omayaks, Muskogee, Omayaks, Mon Jelagi, Omayaks, Okmulgee, Georgia, Levy Youngus, Churchkit, Creole Omis, Mon Jada, Amas, Bobancha Legas. And what I just said to you all as I introduced myself in my ancestral language. I'm Angela Comeaux. I was born and raised in the New Orleans area, which is the colonized name for New Orleans. The initial and original name for it was Bobancha, and it was a Choctaw word meaning place of many tongues. And I also introduced myself to say that my father is also from the Bobancha area, and then my mother is from Okmulgee, Georgia, and she is Bear Clan. And that is a typical way that Indigenous people introduce themselves. And it is because we belong to our place. So when we introduce ourselves, we relate it to a place because we belong to the land that we come from. The land does not belong to us. So that I feel is an important framing in relation to this conversation. Also, I want to thank you all for inviting me today because I am not Christian. So it's very brave, I feel. And I did, when Reverend Michael and Reverend Brooks introduced me, they said that they were with the church. And I was like, hey, I just want to let you guys know I'm not Christian. I don't know how this conversation is going to go. So, I do want to reference that as well. I grew up in a household that practiced Native spirituality. My whole upbringing and my way of life is based around that spirituality, as well as my thought processes on our relationship to land and all of the inhabitants to the land. So I don't have a whole lot to say yet. So thank you guys for allowing me to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for that. We are eager to kind of jump into conversation. Michael, do you have any questions to get us started? I can easily come up with some, but jump in.
No, actually, we have a question that was in the Q&A. And I'm assuming that this is to Katerina. It says, when you talk about church being the largest landowner, is that all churches, denominations, or just UCC churches?
Well, I don't think it's the UCC church alone, but I'm talking about kind of capital C church here. When I talk about church, those who self-identify as following in the lineage and tradition that grew out of the early Christian church. So I would include, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, non-denominational, Mennonites like myself, included in that. And I actually heard this first through Crystal Tubles and folks working previously with the Indian Collective, who were calling on the church to participate in the land back movement. And they pointed out to us, myself and a group of other pastors and church leaders on a call with them, that the church owns a lot of land, and we've got some responsibilities around what we do with that, as well as how we advocate for public land return.
So let me follow up with another question, but this one is for Angie. And Angie, leaning back, first and foremost, let me tell you, you're not alone in the whole Christian thing. Jesus wasn't a Christian either. I know people don't like to admit that, but it's the truth. Angie, looking back at your tradition and saying, I probably have heard some things about it, but you can verify it because of experience and knowledge. When it comes down to land and looking generationally, what is the outlook, or how does the indigenous thought look at generations to come and land in relation?
So also I should have prefaced this, and whenever I was introducing myself earlier, for those who may not be familiar with, there were originally over 500 tribal nations in just so-called United States. And we're all a little bit different. There are regional similarities. So whenever I speak about my practices, I speak from my own personal experience. I don't speak for all tribal nations. And again, I am of Southeastern descent, so I am Muskogee, Cherokee, and Choctaw, which are very similar, but even they have some differences. Most of us in our creation stories and in our tradition, our outlook on land, it's hard to describe because it's just so ingrained in everything that we do. It's an entity, it's a living being. And generationally, we're actually given instructions on how to take care of it and all of its inhabitants as our most important thing in our life. So it's kind of ingrained in our life ways and in our way of being. So the instructions that are set before us are most importantly to take care of the land and its other inhabitants as if they are living creatures, because they are, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much for that response. I see that Sarah has now joined with us. Sarah, we welcome you. We had a chance to introduce you earlier. I'm hoping to kind of spread the warmth through the digital airwaves here so that you feel at home among us and are welcome and ready to share with us. We love to hear from you and to get your thoughts and perspectives if you'd like to share with us now.
Hi there. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I apologize for the difficulty getting on. I am coming to you today from the homeland of the Confederated Bands and Tribes of the Yakima Nation here in the Yakima Indian Reservation. And our connectivity is not always awesome. So I apologize for that. And thanks so much for all of your tech professionals who've been giving me all these different options to try and get on. So thanks very much. And I'm here on my phone. So I'm really excited to be part of this conversation about land back. And I apologize that I don't get to reflect on what my colleagues have already said. So I'm just going to start to talk a little bit about how I see land back from a systemic perspective. So one of the things that I think is a little bit challenging in the United States, where I'm from and I grew up, being native to here, is this cultural emphasis on individualism. So often when we think about whatever we're thinking about, we're trying to look at it through an individualist lens. So private property is actually enshrined, I would say, as a core and fundamental value in the United States. That is really one of the major pillars or bases of the US Constitution. And so often we think about how our society is arranged and the rules are arranged, that is laws and policies. It is really around protecting the sanctity of private property. So therefore laws are arranged in a way to protect private property owners. And that's really like a primary lens that we don't really question. And one of the things I want to ask us to consider is, what is land back from a systemic viewpoint? So beyond my home, my family, what does land back mean from a collective or a systemic point of view? So we know that in the world, the largest private land is the church. So the church owns an enormous amount of land. And when we think about that, we think, oh, that's a Catholic church. But honestly, I'm a Mennonite from a Mennonite tradition, and Mennonites own a ton of land. And I'm guessing a lot of churches do. I'm guessing the United Church of Christ owns a lot of land. What does land back mean from the perspective of a systemic approach to returning land? So aside from saying, hey, we want to encourage individuals to change their hearts and minds and think about it from that perspective, what does it mean as an institution to take on that identity and to think about how the Christian church has been one of the primary beneficiaries of the process of colonization? Wealth and power have been accumulated by the church. And what is the church's stance in terms of redress and righting that injustice for which the church has been a beneficiary? So, and this is what I'm wondering. So we think about land, and the church is a private landowner. How long has the church benefited from processes of colonization? And what kind of a systemic approach can be taken in terms of righting that or balancing power? So, and I'm saying this requires a conversation that's beyond just saying we're going to give all of our land back, which is kind of a, unrealistic and hard to imagine. Where's the conversation? So, for example, is it possible to say, anytime we're dealing with land, whether we're renting it, whether we're renting it out, we're receiving rents, we are liquidating land. What is our stance in terms of setting aside a portion of that wealth for Indigenous peoples in the purpose of serving the purpose of self-determination, right? So decolonization from the perspective of institutional ownership of being a beneficiary of a deep structural sin. So, and I guess I want to think about that as a society as well. When we're talking about land back, you know, we have access to state land, to federal land. How do we as an institutional church, but also as congregations or as families, think about inviting our states or our federal governments to embark on discovery of land back? What is repair in the context of a nation that built its wealth on colonization, justification for dehumanizing Indigenous peoples, removing Indigenous peoples from their lands, and financially benefiting from the consistent and habitual oppression of Indigenous peoples? So how do we invite the state and the federal government to embark on a process of repair with an eye to land back? So those are some of the thoughts that I have right off the bat, and I'm not sure if I'll pause there, and if you give me the go ahead, then I can keep going, but I also don't want to just dominate the conversation.
No, you've been terrific. Thank you so much for jumping right in and sharing with us. We really appreciate that. We're continuing to get questions from the audience. One question that we've received is if there are ways in which you see the land back movement connecting with climate justice and how we address the climate issues today. Is there something that any of you would like to kind of say in addressing that question? Sarah, go for it.
Okay, so I would say that I'm going to reframe that and say decolonization or the movement for decolonization in the United States and around the world, and the movement to resist or to address climate change, I would say are very much embedded together, because the logic that has led to climate change is a logic of extraction, using resources with the purpose of extracting those resources and using up natural resources to make money, basically. And so that process is damaging not just to Indigenous people, but to all people. And the logic of decolonization is different from that extractive logic. So that logic is about repair, and it is about harvest, and it's about living in balance or in harmony with reality as we understand it, which is within the life support systems of Earth. And so one of the things that I notice that has been really true over time is that environmentalists and Indigenous peoples movements do not always see eye to eye. And I'm really noticing this right now coming up because I'm experiencing environmental activists who are saying, hey, you know, in order for us to get to a carbon-free economy, we need to extract more minerals. So we want to do copper mining and lithium mining so we can make solar panels and electric cars and so on, lithium batteries. And we're going to do that on Indigenous people's lands because, you know, Indigenous people need to take the hit. You just need to take one for the team so that we can get to a green economy. And I find that to be really disturbing because if our emphasis is on finding, hey, we want to get to a carbon-free economy, that's still an extractive model. We're still going to extract resources and pollute waterways and aquifers for the purpose of whatever it is, as opposed to saying, hey, we actually need to find a way to live in balance with the life support systems of Earth. And so I think land back is a natural response in saying, hey, let's think about providing Indigenous peoples with the opportunity to serve as the caretakers of Earth that they've done sustainably for untold generations, with a logic that is not an extractive logic. Maybe the rest of us have something to learn from that, from living in a different way than just through this extractive logic.
That was a great answer. I did want to talk about mapping for a second, because one of the questions that we had, first and foremost, they wanted us to know that the map that was shown was incomplete. But secondly, when we look at mapping out, because you all have said that the church owns a lot of land, is there a map that actually shows how much land the church owns and where it's located? And that can go to whomever can answer that. I'm not sure.
I'm aware of a map. It's not necessarily how much the church owns, but there is a map that it's actually a graphic that shows how much land was taken from Indigenous people throughout the history of so-called United States, and how much is left actually in Indigenous hands. So it doesn't break down who owns what, but it does show how much is actually left remaining to Indigenous people, which is not a lot. So that does exist, and I can find that and drop that in the chat.
There is a very helpful map from Creation Justice Ministries, one of the, I think, sponsors of this call, of church camp lands, which I think, wow, what a great opportunity. The church owns a lot of camp lands and public lands nearby. Not that they own those lands, but the map shows public lands near campgrounds. And one of the, in a fellowship program I was part of with Creation Justice Ministries, one of the Indigenous advisors who spoke into that process really lifted that up, saying, what if the church camps, asked, could we stay on these lands of Indigenous hosts, or transferred their title? There are huge swaths of land owned by camps, and camps are closing. Unfortunately, some church denominations are giving the lowest priority lands, or the ones that are maybe not in great shape, to Indigenous peoples. So I also want to lift up, not just land return, but land restoration. What is the restoration of that land that needs to happen, and the funds to go with it when land transfers are happening? And then another, just to add to Sarah's point, I think not only the lands that the church owns, but how can the church advocate for return of public lands and use our power, shift our power towards key lands, because there are some priority areas for Indigenous peoples. For example, the sacred Black Hills. Lakota peoples have been struggling for generations for the return of the Black Hills. And what if the church were to shift our collective power into that struggle? Or what about Dakota land return? Our coalition partners with a group called Makoche Chupe, working for Dakota land return in Minnesota. And we've been a part of organizing repair communities across what's now called the US, but across this country of communities, church communities, and faith-based groups working for repair. One of those communities has been fundraising to help Dakota peoples buy back key homelands. Since, as Angie has mentioned, land is not just about property, but it's about language and life and culture, so much more than just sort of a resource. So by restoring their homelands, they're able to restore language, life, foodways, culture, and so much more in Dakota homelands.
I'd like to jump in and talk about. Oh, go ahead.
I wanted to respond and just say, I think it would be so exciting. I appreciate the question about what lands does the church own. And I want to suggest it's a great idea as national denominations are thinking about repair, maybe it's a good idea for the church itself to map its own lands. Like, what land do you own? Why not encourage your own church to map the lands that you own?
I love these ideas. Angie, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on the question you had posed earlier, and just kind of to piggyback on the end of what Sarah had started to say. Like, it's hard for people to imagine giving back land. And we do quite literally mean, yes, we want the land back. However, that's not 100% feasible in all situations. It's hard. However, you can return, and especially in relation to environmental issues, you can return the land to Indigenous stewardship. We were able to maintain these lands since time immemorial. And in less than 450 years, we have completely depleted them through extractive measures. That doesn't have to be the case. Indigenous people worldwide have shown that we have a relationship, because we have an earth-based religion and earth-based culture, that we are able to live in harmony with the land and teach others how to do that as well. And land back can be simply allowing Indigenous people to take care of the land.
Angie, I appreciate what you're saying. And I'm just wondering, what would it be like if, in order to give a land lease in the United States, that is for drilling, fracking, whatever, you had to actually go through the filter of the Indigenous people closest to where that's going to happen? What if they were the decision maker about that? I mean, that's a way of transferring that stewardship to Indigenous people. Just to put it in really concrete terms, how might climate change be impacted if Indigenous people were the ones deciding how we were going to extract?
Exactly. And in some cases, they are starting to do that. There is a literal land back happening. There are a few land trusts. I'm actually trying to work on that currently. We're trying to form a land trust here at Hummingbird Springs Farm, but there are some pockets throughout North America where they are putting that land back in Indigenous hands. But yes, there are some companies that are beginning to put their feelers out in the community, try to have relationships with Indigenous people in their areas, and then get their input. Take it a step further. I do know some of the teachings of Christ, and if you believe that you're going to follow a good road, you know that it's not an easy road. Doing the right thing is not easy. It's hard. Do that hard work. Do the things that are unimaginable. To put your money where your mouth is. Like, if you want to see a good result, you have to do the hard things and make them happen.
Thank you for all this rich conversation that we're having. I know that a conversation that has bubbled up here and there, I know in the United Church of Christ among our churches, is often surrounding the matter of land acknowledgements. And so I want to hit upon that because I know it's a subject that often comes up. And one of the times it came up was, if some of you may recall, a couple of years ago, a group of Indigenous anthropologists issued a statement calling for a moratorium on land acknowledgements, saying that often they did more harm than good. And that created some conversation among some of our churches that had been practicing land acknowledgements. So I'd be curious if you have, thoughts on that. I remember there was a webinar just a few months ago called From Land Acknowledgement to Land Back. And so I'd be just kind of curious, thoughts and responses on that matter.
We, as a group, I'm a member of a few different Indigenous-led groups, and we're frequently asked to give land acknowledgements because we're Indigenous people. And a few years ago, it seemed like initially it seemed like a good thing to do. I actually have given some myself. However, when the relationship ends with that acknowledgement of whose land you're on, you're doing more harm than good. Because all you're doing is saying, oh, we're acknowledging that we took your land. Why don't you come and speak, most of the time for free, on who we stole it from, and then the relationship ends there. It really needs to be a communication, a conversation, a relationship building. What are you doing for that Indigenous community whose land that you're on, and who you're benefiting from it being stolen from?
Because I was just gonna say it's all talk. It's just like the apologies and the statements that go out whenever our Black lives are snuffed out in the streets. We get a lot of statements and a lot of apologies, but nothing, no action goes behind that. And it's the same with land acknowledgement. If it's just that they acknowledge land and we let them go on, there's no other further conversations and no in a real way reparations. Let's name it. Let's not beat around the bush on it. If no reparations come behind it, then we've done nothing to repair. It's just all talk. And I believe it was somebody in scripture said that's just sound and brass and tingling cymbals. I don't know. I'm just saying.
Sarah, it looked like you were about to jump in. Did you want to contribute?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to ask Katerina to respond because our coalition made a land acknowledgement guide, and there's something that, Katerina, you're going to be able to describe that much better than I can. And, just to note, I've been asked by leaders in the national church, kind of in the wings, hey, could you do the land acknowledgement today? To which I say no, because that takes time and effort, and I'm not prepared for that. Just because I'm brown doesn't mean I'm going to do a land acknowledgement where I haven't done the research. I'm somewhere away from home, and, I'm not like born knowing how to do that. It takes time and effort, and I would want to reach out to people there and so on to do that, a good job of that. So I want to acknowledge, that happens where people say, hey, you're here, you're Native, you do it. It's like, no, first of all. And second of all, I had the great privilege of leading our Washington State Redistricting Commission in 2021 and 2022. This is when you determine where the lines are going to be drawn for representation in the legislature. And, there was a request that there were people on that commission who wanted to do land acknowledgement. And I said, no, I don't think it's appropriate because our institution only exists for a year and a half every 10 years and is not able to make an institutional commitment to actually seek redress or repair. And so it's inappropriate. It's just pro forma, and I wouldn't accept that. So I actually value land acknowledgement when it is used as a step towards repair. And so I'd like Katerina to talk about how we are approaching that within the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, if you're willing, Katerina.
Sure, Sarah. And as you were talking, I pulled up a certificate that Indigenous advisors, I'll show you in a moment, but Indigenous advisors for the resource that I put in the chat came up with a kind of tongue-in-cheek certificate for congregations that do a land acknowledgement but don't pursue justice. And I think that is really, I think Angie and Sarah's point, the ultimate goal is moving beyond land acknowledgements towards justice. And at the same time, we in our coalition work with a lot of white settler congregations and communities for whom they have grown up in an educational system with Indigenous peoples invisibilized. And their starting step is just learning that they're on Indigenous lands and doing some research around that. Land acknowledgements are sort of an opening step that are already out there and have gained popularity, that have kind of caught on in church communities more and more. And so we figured, why not ride that and sort of use that opportunity and opening to not have that be the ultimate goal. Zacchaeus didn't end with saying, I acknowledge that I stole from people, or I acknowledge that I have unjust gains, and that was his ending point. No, he went forward, and it opened up into something more. There's an awakening that can happen with land acknowledgements and the repetitive reminder that we have an obligation. We are on these lands, naming the peoples that they're on, inviting input when appropriate from local tribal nations, if that's something that they're open to, that is part of, for us, a broader framework of reparative justice, of starting with acknowledging whose lands we're on, but moving towards steps like putting restitution in church budgets, seeking land returns, seeking ways we can be in solidarity with Indigenous people locally and globally. That's part of a framework for a way of joining our coalition called the Repair Network. So we kind of use land acknowledgement statements as an opening, but not an ending point. And I'm just going to share my screen real quick. If you can see this certificate of acknowledgement that some Indigenous advisors recommended that we create. So this is for churches that use land acknowledgements, as Angie or Sarah were saying, as sort of a pat on the back check mark as an ending point. You're welcome to print this out, and it's available in our land acknowledgement guide. We created a land acknowledgement and we have done nothing more. So that is sort of a tongue-in-cheek nudge to push people forward into the repair work that's beyond land acknowledgement.
I
Thank you
love
so
land.
much.
I love land acknowledgement online, and that is hilarious to me. There's a question that came that was more concerning youth, and I'll ask it straight out the way that it was written. Question for any panelists with gratitude. Many settler youth and young adults are unlikely ever to personally own land in terms of houses / properties under the current economic structure, which makes land back conversations have a different impact generationally. Being a member of a church is one of the few ways a young person can have any access to shared space that they can take responsibility for and can learn to love and can be formed by. Meanwhile, some churches are divesting, themselves of their buildings. Is it possible to use church / sacred spaces as a way to grow love for the land and responsibility among the present generation?
When I think about that question, I think it's, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much for that question. I think about how our entire conversation around land is really grounded and rooted in an individualist understanding. An individual, myself, my home, my community. And I'm wondering if we can broaden that conversation to be more systemic. One of the most effective ways that we can seek justice is collectively. And so there are many Indigenous peoples across our country that are struggling right now to preserve their lands and the lands where they have worshiped for generations. Can we not join them in that struggle? So for example, I'm going to lift up the San Carlos Apache at Oak Flat. They are trying to block the largest copper mine in the history of the United States from going in. It will decimate the sacred site of Oak Flat, where the Apache and many Indigenous groups have prayed and worshiped for generations and generations of time. So they are struggling right now in the appellate court. This case will most likely go to the Supreme Court. The mine, if it's successful, will create a pit that is 10 stories deep and 2 miles across in the middle of the Arizona aquifer. We can, as people of faith, choose to stand with the stronghold Apache or the San Carlos struggle. There are many ways we can participate in land back. It's not just about individual buildings. So I want to say we have congregations, I shouldn't say we have, there are congregations joining with the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery across the country and even in Canada and Mexico that are poised themselves to struggle along with the San Carlos Apache. That is a thing that they are doing within their sacred spaces and buildings as well. And I also want to say, I saw in the chat, there was a comment that there are Mennonites who are currently colonists in Central and South America. And yes, I acknowledge that as a member of the Mennonite Church. That is absolutely true. There are old order Mennonite colonies doing that right now. And guess what? We are working in solidarity with with Mayan collectives that are seeking to preserve their land, specifically in the Yucatan Peninsula, where Mennonite colonies are actually impacting their survival and economy. So we are choosing and encouraging people across the United States, Canada, and Mexico to stand with them in their struggle as they protect their sacred waters and their sacred land. So I would like for us to consider really expanding our understanding of what we can do. We're not just talking about buildings here. Let's talk about bigger things. We can talk about national parks, state parks, but we can talk about really standing together with Indigenous peoples as they are defining what lands are to be protected and seeking self-determination on those.
Sarah, thank you so much. And, I think you're getting to kind of a heart of a lot of great stuff there. I kind of want to just shift a little bit to go back to something that Katerina said, kind of talked about in her opening presentation. I want to make sure we kind of get in there before we have to bring things to a close, which is, Katerina, you were talking about kind of decolonization. And so I'm thinking, if I'm a member of a church, a pastor, I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to bring this decolonization emphasis to our theology, the way we do church? I think we've got some examples that have been given, but is there something kind of more you can kind of just flesh out for us in terms of what kind of change in mindset or worldview or approach to our faith and our scriptures that people should be considering when they think about really taking on and being serious about decolonization?
Well, I'll really open that up for Sarah or Angie to respond to first, and then I may have a thought or two to contribute afterwards. Sarah or Angie?
Decolonization is a hard, long process because it's so ingrained in everything in our modern society that we do. And it's from capitalism, patriarchy, religion. Our entire lifeways is based off of what we've been colonized to live in. And it's going to take a lot of work to decolonize. And even in the topics that we're discussing today. With land back, go to Indigenous people and ask them what they need. Don't put yourself in that equation. Ask them what they need. Listen to the earth. Ask the earth what it needs. It's a living entity. It's a living being. So there's a whole, we can have a whole nother conversation on decolonization, but I want us to think about like how it impacts, because the act of colonization is colonizers came here, they took lands, and they systematically enacted and put their way of life on the people that were already here, including the way that they dressed, the way that they behaved, how they acted in society, their religious beliefs, their worldviews. And you have to take all of that away. And that's decolonization.
And so I take decolonizing scripture really seriously. And the first thing I want to say, and I'll make a few brief comments, is please consider reaching out to us and joining our repair network. So this is just ordinary congregations, people who are grappling with these questions. In a vacuum, we have created a community where we can work through these things together. Please consider reaching out to us, the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, and potentially joining our repair network of congregations and people and groups that are struggling with this question. I want to say, in terms of decolonizing scripture or sort of our faith spaces and so on, I just want to ask this sort of generalized question, in terms of what do we see as life-giving? And we have sort of been brought up in a culture that is really strange and artificial, that views accumulation of wealth and resources as the end all, and also the accumulation of security, which is extractive logic. It's built on extractive logic. And I see decolonization as the opposite of that, seeking balance with the life support systems of the earth, which means dwelling on the earth in a way that is light, and that when you leave space for the next generation, that is to say, when you leave this planet, you're leaving it as you found it. And so this is the example that my ancestors left for me, and really embarking on how to do that collectively is, for me, at the heart of decolonization. That is acknowledging reality as it is. We live in a closed system of mutual dependence, and rejecting this worldview of extractive logic, which says the most important thing in the world is me and what happens in my lifetime. And that is really the culture that is the mainstream culture. So decolonization is trying to get to something else, reality, true reality. We live in a closed system of mutual dependence. Closed system meaning no new inputs, no outputs. If we create nuclear waste, there's nowhere for it to go. And we use up all the oxygen, there's no more. The water is contaminated, that's it. There's no new water. So living in reality as it really is. This is also an example that's been given to me.
Thank you so much. Katerina, did you want to offer some words now?
Yeah, off of that, I just hear so much good news in that word decolonization. I hear good news for everyone. You know, when the Apache Stronghold shared with us about Oak Flat and they invited us into their struggle, they told us, we're fighting for all of you. This isn't just for our sacred site or the restoration of our lands. This is about water. This is about earth. This is about seeing this land as sacred together. And I just want to offer one final hopeful example of land return and speak to, I think for a lot of white folks like me or those in dominant culture, there can be a sense of fear or loss when we talk about these opportunities for land return or decolonization. And yet I think there's such possibility. For example, I had the chance to talk with an Indigenous scholar, Hoopa, from Northern California in the state where I live, Dr. Kutcha Riesling-Baldi, about the land return of Tuluwat Island in 2004 to the Wiyot tribe from the city of Eureka. And she said that it was in part a donation from evangelical churches, from what I understand, in the area that sparked the possibility of land return to the Wiyot. And this was the island that was returned was the site of a massacre in 1860 of a huge community of women and children by white settlers who went in there. And the city of Eureka, over many years of conversation with the Wiyot people, actually returned their sacred site, or the island. And I'm just going to put a quote in the chat because I don't have time to read it, but it really addresses this sense of fear. People ask, what's going to happen to me? Are we going to get kicked out? And she says, no, what's actually happened was the Wiyot cleaned up the island. It was a pollution waste site. And now it's a climate resilient site. It's contributed to climate justice. It's an ecosystem benefit. This is what tends to happen when you give the land back. People don't build a giant fence around it and kick everyone out. There's a return to health, restoration, and community. So that's a story that I just want to end on and invite people to learn more about as they learn from the examples that Sarah and Angie have shared as well.
That's a great story, and it's a terrific story to end on. Michael, do you have some closing words? And just so our audience knows, as always, we'll be having a post-webinar action session led by Thaddeus Elliott from our Washington, D.C. advocacy office to help us kind of walk the talk and put into practice our faith through action. And so before we head in, and unfortunately all the good things have to come to an end, Michael, do you have some closing words and summations for us?
Thank you all very much for your inputs, and thank you for helping us to further understand land back. We look forward to getting involved as best that we can in that. And again, I'm so very appreciative. If there's anything that I'd like to leave, it's that we again must get involved. We can't do this thing alone. No one can do it. We can't achieve justice as individual islands, but collectively we can work together, and we the people can win. Thank you all for joining us, for those that are listening. And again, thank you to our panelists, and thank you, Reverend Brooks.
Yes, thank you so much to our panelists. We are so grateful that you were able to join us today, and I look forward to this being an ongoing resource for people to kind of be inspired and to learn from what you have shared today.